pioneering thinkers from countries right around the world. Hello, I'm Shanti, and a very warm welcome to today's Masterclass, a series of 21 masterclasses in new consciousness that is looking at new ways of thinking, of being, and of doing in today's rapidly changing world. Of course, in these days of coronavirus, we're all of us having to observe the guidelines for our physical safety to keep us safe and protected. But what about the spiritual laws that are there? Are we also observing those and making sure that we're feeling really safe and connected from within? My name is Philippa, and I'll be with you throughout this series as together we listen to the experience of yogis and meditators from countries right around the world as they share with us their tools, their navigational tools for coping with these times of change. Now, one of the features for many of us of this period of lockdown has been the chance to have more time, to slow down, to really become aware of our surroundings, and within that the sounds that are happening around us that when we're more busy we maybe don't notice. So for me it's been about really taking notice of birdsong, of listening to the flapping of wings of a flock of geese as they fly overhead, or listening to the humming of a bee, or the distant barking of a dog. These sounds that are around us all the time have felt much more acute, and I've been much more aware of them. And for those of us on a spiritual path, of course, meditation often involves listening to the sound of music. And there is something about music that can act as a gateway to the soul. It can open us up into higher realms of consciousness. And it's interesting how it does that, and why does music have the effect on us that it does? Well, today's masterclass is on it precisely that, on going from sound into silence, the meditation experience. All of our speakers are students and teachers of the Brahma Kumaris World Spiritual University, and as that name suggests, it's a place for learning and understanding about the self, about the soul, and about time and the mysteries of how the world works the way it does. It's an organisation that was founded in India in 1936 through a series of visions and teachings that came through the original founder, Brahma Baba. And they're very much teachings that are relevant to today's time of change, this transitional phase that many of us feel that we are going through at the moment. Now, the founder, Brahma Baba, decided quite early on that it was women that should be in front. And as a result of that, the Brahma Kumaris is now the largest spiritual organisation of its kind in the world to be led by women. Well, let me introduce you to our masterclass conductor, holding the baton for today's musical offering in our masterclass series. It's someone whose life has really been defined by music. He's one of Australia's leading composers in art, screen and traditional music, working tirelessly for many years, preserving the vanishing musical traditions of different countries and cultures around the world. Indeed, his music has been played at venues right around the world, including the United Nations, the Olympics, and the White House. He's also Associate Professor and Head of Music at the Australian National University in Canberra. And as if all that wasn't enough, Dr. Kim Cunio has also been a student and teacher of meditation with the Brahma Kumaris for over 20 years. Kim, thank you so much for joining us on Masterclass. It's great to be with you. Thank you.
Philippa, thank you for the beautiful introduction, and hello everyone.
Now, for you, it must be quite strange because your life in many ways falls evenly into two halves. One where you are constantly surrounded by music, by the sounds that your beautiful musical instruments are making, and obviously the noises of being in a student university environment. But then the other half of your life, which is very much diving into the experience of stillness and silence and meditation. Do you think those two halves of your life work off each other? Do they work together?
Well, this is the goal of every meditator, I think, is to say that we start by having experiences. And to all of us who are students of meditation, I think we are gifted some experiences when we start, and they're just a really remarkable thing. But as time goes on, we have to work a little bit more to continue to have those experiences. Sometimes we change our diet or our lifestyle or our way of being with the world. And inevitably, it comes to a point where we say that this experience of oneness or togetherness shouldn't just be really for the act of meditation. It should be throughout our lives. And so much of our lives are spent in work that for me, I do try and make it the same if I can. And certainly something that music offers is, I often say that music opens the window to the soul, but to really get the door open takes meditation. So we have something in music like any good musician, any person who's playing an instrument or composing, it's like something of the soul will inevitably come to the surface. And so I find that I have something really beautiful to start a dialogue with anyone involved in music.
And what is your understanding of why music affects us in the way that it does? I've heard people say that it's because we listen to the sound of the heartbeat when we're in the womb. But is it deeper than that? Why does it affect us so profoundly?
There were so many answers on that. So I'll go through a couple that I think are really indicative of where we're at now in terms of this understanding. One is that the mainstream spiritual answer, which I really love, and I might reference a really great musical teacher called Hazrat Inayat Khan, who founded the world's Sufi order, but before that was a really masterful player in Indian classicism. And he said that what happens is that music is the most mystical of the arts. And by saying that, he said that something happens when we make music, that the deepest self, or what could be called the superconscious, can actually emerge into the body. So it's like that we have, all of us, a higher self that's just waiting for the opportunity to come out. And the notion of participating in music or listening to music in a sacred state enables that to happen. And he had a phrase called the lataif, these centers which are a little bit like the Indian chakras that could be activated by particular scales or thoughts. So variations of this are in all our spiritual traditions. But modern neuroscience tells us something very, very fascinating, that when we listen to music or we play with music or along to music, our brain lights up like nothing else. So to be a really functional musician, the only thing that comes close to it is speaking multiple languages. So to any of you brothers or sisters in India, you have such an advantage because India is such a multilingual, culture or series of cultures, because something very similar happens when you speak 3 or 4 languages as when you speak music, which is that the different hemispheres of the brain light up at the same time, and connections between the empathic and the reasoning selves become much easier. The only thing that does something similar to me is meditation.
So in a way, what we're saying here is that there's something about music that bypasses our conscious mind and gets through to us without our normal filters that are there to try and analyse and interpret the world around us. This just speaks to us directly.
Yes, and it's even better than that, because not only does it bypass the conscious mind, we can still use it whenever we want. So we don't have to leave our intellect at the door when we're making music. It's like the human brain and the human body know exactly what to do. I find it astonishing when I'm looking at really great young virtuosi who are playing an instrument, because, they're putting in, people say it's the sort of 10,000 hour rule, that you need about 10,000 hours to get good on an instrument. Really, we think now it's about 40,000 hours. But something happens after about this 10,000 hour mark where things that had to be conscious become unconscious, and so there's this ability for music itself to become patternistic in the human intellect and brain. So it can become like breathing in the end. And even though when we start, just to get your fingers around an instrument can be so difficult, 20 or 30 years later, it can be as easy as breathing.
Now, you're very much a child of different cultural heritages and backgrounds. Was music and music from around the world always a part of your life growing up? Were you always exposed to that? And how do you think that affected you?
Well, I did have an unusual upbringing for an Australian, because Australia, as any of you who aren't from Australia would know, is a very multicultural society. But when I was younger, it wasn't quite as multicultural as it is now. So there was a sense of a dominant Anglo culture within these emerging cultures. But my mother was born in Myanmar, and she has Indian Jewish heritage. So I was brought up from her with a love of, not so much Burmese music, but Burmese tradition and thinking was certainly in her mind. But she grew up a lot of her time in India. She actually was a refugee, ended up in India at age 13 and, spent quite a long time in India, and that really formed her as a person. So she loved every aspect of India. She thinks still, well, she's left the body now, but she thought during her life that India was the most remarkable country in the world for what it did. And she was very much alive at the time of our founder in the Brahma Kumaris, Brahma Baba. And so that was a big part of my childhood, was looking at this tradition. And then my father is an Iraqi Jew who grew up in Shanghai. His father was from a place called Izmir, which was called Smyrna at the time. So he had a couple of foundational aspects. One is what's called Sephardic Judaism. The Jews who left Spain in 1492, who were asked by Ferdinand and Isabella to leave very, very quickly, incidentally the same year that Columbus sailed to find the New World, which is just one of those amazing, coincidences. On his mother's side, it was a very old and, quite an exalted tradition that his grandfather was the chief rabbi of, a large part of Iraq. And so he looked after Jewish communities throughout China, also in Hong Kong, in Singapore, and a number of other cultures. I grew up with this, I guess you would say, a combination of sounds, but a sacred combination of sounds. So I thought it was quite normal to hear, particularly, the sounds of Judaism, but also the sounds of Islam and the sounds of Hinduism as really foundational parts of my childhood. It was only when I got into high school and I realized, other people didn't do that. Other people listened to popular music. So I tried to catch up.
And of course, it's no surprise, therefore, that as an adult you were keen to journey and travel back to some of these countries and exploring the musical traditions when you got there. And in some situations, you were actually reconstructing the ancient instruments and bringing them back into life so that we could hear them in the present day. What were those projects that you were doing, and what was that experience for you of listening to music as it would have been listened to way back in history?
On one level, it was a dream to do this sort of work because, like many young musicians, I'd been to the conservatorium and done my studies. And I remember thinking in my final exam, what will I do with my life now? Because I knew I had this spiritual inclination. I was thinking at the time I hadn't discovered the Brahma Kumaris, but I had a strong engagement with Tibetan Buddhism. So I was strongly considering to become a monk. But I'd had this thought that I'd studied these very strong traditional methods of analysis in Western musicology. And I thought, surely they have a role to play in the reconstruction of vanishing music without myself just being a Western musicologist who comes in and says, I know better because I'm trained in this particular tradition. So I found the method, which has had different names, but it's descended from a fellow called Bronislaw Malinowski. And he was a very interesting sociologist in the period of the First World War. And he was stuck on a place called the Trebraibrand Islands. And what he had to do was, he was there for so long that he had to become a participant and an observer in the cultures he was studying, rather than just saying he would write about it for the Royal Society. And I think that I found that very, very inspirational as a young musician, that I could literally be with or sit with practitioners, particularly practitioners of vanishing musical traditions. And just by sitting with them, when they gave me permission to start interpreting, I would then follow their lead. So it was very different from myself coming in with the ideas of knowing what to do. I became a follower. But at the same time, I started getting lots of commissions to do this work once I had formulated it. And I think many of us have had this experience. Once we come up with something that is of genuine service to the world, it's like we're suddenly told, well, you have to get busy doing it because that's our little task at this time. So some of the projects I worked on, my first big project was the music of the Dead Sea Scrolls. Now, these were discovered in 1948 by a young boy called Muhammad El-Dib, and he actually just went into these caves at Qumran and found these masses of texts. At the time, no one knew how old they were, but we now know that they're written around the same generation or two generations as the historical Jesus. They even describe a fellow called the Teacher of Righteousness that some scholars have said may well be Jesus himself. So it's a very big thing to then study. So I had to look at, how to best understand ancient Jewish writing, do my own translations, and then transcribe vanishing musical traditions from Iraq and Yemen, and then see how they could work with these texts. One of the most exciting things in that commission was to discover Psalm 151. There were 150 psalms in the canonized Bible, so if you get the King James Bible out or something else and you look up psalms, there were 150. But there were 154 in the collection at Qumran, which lead us to think that that things were a little bit different in the past, that, notions of what spirituality were broader and still open to much more interpretation. And from that project, I just went from project to project for about 10 or 12 years, looking at sacred musical and sacred art collections. And it was an astonishing time of my life. Some of the highlights were the Garden and Cosmos collection, which is the Maharaja of Jodhpur's sacred art collection, which is so beautiful. That went to the British Library and the Smithsonian and also to Australia. And then I, at one point, got to do the Egyptian antiquities of the Louvre. So I got to think about what is even, the oldest Egyptian music, which was just fascinating. And another project was the Khalili collection of Islamic art, the largest private collection of Islamic art in the world, including Genghis Khan's solid gold saddle and an astonishing array of Qurans and some texts that literally blew my mind, including like the Mongol chronicles of the world, the Mongols telling the story of world history until then. So getting to work on those things has really been a big part of my life because they've taken all my intellectual capabilities. But as I've gone into them, I've realized it's all about spirituality, that the people who wrote this music and wrote these texts, they are looking for a way to systemize often the experiences they've had of something greater. And isn't that nice to think that that experience can still be ours today?
It's absolutely extraordinary. And I'm trying to get my mind around what it must have been like for you to, say, be presented with those psalms that perhaps hadn't been seen before, or to be standing in front of the Maharaja of Jodhpur's art collection or the Egyptian collection at the Louvre. And I'm wondering, as a composer, what is that process? How do you interpret what is a visual experience and put that into music? Is it almost like the piece itself whispers in your ear and you just somehow intuit what the sound of that particular piece would be? How do you do that?
Well, I have to answer that question by thanking one of my main composition teachers. In Australia, we had three very famous composers in the 1950s to the 1970s, and mine was one of them, Nigel Butterley. And he was the great sort of mystic of Australian composition at the time. He was a very religious man. And when he taught me, he saw a bit of himself in me. So instead of saying, I'm going to teach you actually how to write music or work on your orchestration or do an analysis of a Bach cantata, he said, I'm going to leave you to take care of that stuff yourself. I think you're capable. So we're going to look at actually observing the world. So for some time, my lessons with him were watching him work. So literally watching, a master composer in his studio, quietly doing nothing while he literally just wrote music on a page. It was astonishing. And then after a while, we both came to the conclusion that we should go and see art collections together. So we had about a year where we actually looked at art together, and some version of what you just described emerged to me, as it had to his own career, that it's possible if we meditate and really put all our intellectual and spiritual capacities into observing something, to trust ourselves to have an authentic response. So it was trusting myself that I could have that response, but after finding that response, it's very important to use the intellect and to use it rigorously. So I think that's my particular skill or methodology, is this combination of quite, rigorous intellectualism without being bound to it, because I think it's only useful as a tool, and a very fantastic tool at that.
And for you to reproduce authentically the sound that you were intuiting or feeling, in many instances, as we said, it involved actually reconstructing the instruments of that time to really get back to the authentic sound. And you've got a couple of instruments with you there. And I just wonder what that moment was like for you, having created that instrument and then hearing the sound. Did you somehow feel that the instrument was connecting you back through time to those people who would have been playing those instruments at that time? And what kind of sounds did you find that you could make?
This process was very interesting, and I want to credit another one of my teachers, actually my doctoral supervisor, Professor Michael Atherton, because he'd had two commissions, one on ancient Greek music and one on ancient Egyptian music, just like myself. And so he'd actually been thinking for about 10 years about this methodology. He introduced me to a couple of luthiers who had, I guess you would say, it's a strong interest in this side of thinking. It's, of course, almost impossible for anyone to make a living doing this. But what really brought it to the fore was I had a commission, well, it's about 15 years ago, to try and reconstruct music directly of the time of Jesus. It was called the Temple Project, and it was for the Melbourne International Arts Festival and the Australian Jewish Museum and the Gandel Foundation. And what they wanted to do was actually to try and imagine what the Bible described as this orchestra of the ancient world, because there's astonishing descriptions in the Bible of, for example, there's a guy called Hugris the Levite who apparently could stop hundreds of people with his beautiful melisma. Then there's a choir of 12 people minimum performing every service, but potentially up to hundreds in the major festivals, and a permanent orchestra working, for the services, and a whole tribe of the Israelites whose job it was to be professional musicians. So I was so excited by that, and I found through the Haifa Museum actually a fellow called Moshe Fuhrman who'd spent 25 years working with that museum trying to reconstruct those instruments. So I was very lucky that I was essentially able to just, make contact through this museum, and one day, basically, these astonishing instruments arrived in the post. But of course, it was much bigger than that, but literally they arrived, I picked them up, and I was, literally at one point driving around with, these one-off reconstructions of ancient instruments in the car. It felt astonishing because, like you said, when I played them, something did happen. They're difficult to play. They're not as reliable as modern instruments. But we can have a sense when we play these old things that something, maybe it's like we get to some point of less entropy in the world. Many of us think that, of course, the world advances scientifically, but maybe we've come from a point where the spiritual insights were greater in the past. And if we have that thought, or that a thought is even a possibility, to go back in time is to think of maybe a slightly greater purity of human intention. And having that come to me through the instruments was quite astonishing.
It is a fascinating thought when you go back and look at some of the musical compositions that were being created way back in time. The level of awareness and consciousness and spiritual intention that comes through that music is absolutely profound. And a very good example of that, I think, is Hildegard of Bingen, who was the first recognised female composer. And you've made quite a special study of her work. And I wonder what insights we get into the ancient mind through her work.
For those of you who don't know Hildegard of Bingen, a simple Google will bring her up. And she was in some ways a very modern woman in our sense of the word, because she did all the things that a woman could do and many of the things a woman couldn't do. She was actually given to the church in a very strange manner. It was called oblation. At the age of, we think between 5 and 8, probably 8, she was the 10th daughter of a religious family. So she was literally gifted to the church, and a funeral service was held for her at that point because it was the end of her worldly life. Her job then was to meditate with God and help to release our sins, very much in the Benedictine tradition, which is a very mystical but also a very pragmatic tradition. And then she studied with a woman called Jutta when she was younger, and Jutta was quite a rich woman. And over time, Hildegard had a whole series of visions, and in those visions, she started to realize that she was a spiritual teacher herself, a composer herself, a writer of poetry, and also a healer. And this combination was astonishing. So it takes a long time, but by the time she's in her 50s, she's become a really mature woman. She's actually got together her own monastery or her own convent of women. And some of these are very wealthy women. So she's actually able to finance, she's very practical, a really interesting sort of, it's a new social experiment, this idea of a self-governing convent of women with no male figure telling them what to do. She even lectured the Pope on morality. So she was completely fearless. She went on study tours, she went on lecturing tours, and at one point the Pope felt so strongly that she was very special. He gave her a scribe called Godfrey who taught her this craft of music notation, because she had a feeling that the heavenly voices were singing to her, and she heard in her mind's ear heavenly choirs singing divine songs. And so she wrote through this guy called Godfrey of doing the transcriptions for her between 70 and 75 astonishing compositions, including the first modern opera, or what we would call an opera. And so I find her very inspiring. And it's not only myself. I spent a lot of my working and non-working life with a woman called Heather Lee, who we've worked professionally together for many years. And Heather has the perfect voice for Hildegard. So when I first started working with Heather, I played her some Hildegard and she loved it. So we made it a study to go back to the original manuscripts, which are written in a language called pneumatics. So it involved learning a new way to read music, a very old but new way for myself, and to then write modern scores based on that. And from that, we were then able to form a new medieval instrumental ensemble based on living traditional instruments to then accompany this music. And we've done a whole lot of projects. We've recently finished a project called Hildegard in India, which is looking at the relationship between the modes of the Benedictines and the beautiful sounds of the Indian raga system, particularly in Carnatic music, because it's a similar level of structural foundation. They're existing at similar points in world history. So we wanted to see what was similar, and what we found was similar was this unquestioning belief in the power of combinations of notes, what we would call scales, to transform human consciousness on a single listening. Isn't that astonishing?
And it still has that effect on us even today.
Yes, I believe very strongly that this is one of the reasons why music is so powerful to us, because there's a sense of it being an absolute art form. Now, most of the music we listen to it's what we would call in musicology programmatic. In other words, it tells a story. So you go to the movies and you see the film score, in a Bollywood or a Hollywood film, and it's enabling a narrative device to be told. Even much of the great symphonic repertoire in Western classical music is programmatic. It's telling the story of places and times. But in a deeper sense, music is absolute. It gives us a completely undefinable but reproducible feeling as a species when we listen to it. And this is one of the holy grails of musicology, to find out if people of different cultures can have the same experience listening to different music. About 100 years ago, we felt very strongly that it was the case. Now we've tempered that idea with the idea that, of course, so much is cultural and so much is about what I would call the individual journey of the soul, but we could say the individual intellect if we have a problem with the soul. But certainly no one disputes the power of music to change people's consciousness or understanding or even thought patterns. This is all well understood and well defined and well studied these days.
It's very interesting to think that, we consider ourselves to be modern creatures, and yet actually, if we take that idea of being a soul, throughout history, it's the soul of humanity has been the same. It feels the same. It expresses itself in the same way. And actually, throughout time, the experience has been one experience. And we touch into that in our today's modern society in just the same way as they touched into it then. Kind of really makes you feel the timelessness, in a way, of the qualities of the soul and how music resonates with those qualities.
Philippa, I agree completely. But yet it's not even just music or the soul, it's everything. Even this physical world that we feel is so solid, it's such an illusion, because if we look at a grain of sand, that grain of sand has outlasted us. It's outlasted our parents' generations. It's been around since the dawn of humanity. If we look at the air we breathe, that essentially is the same air in the wonderful bubble of our miraculous earth. It's the same air that was breathed 1,000 years ago. It's quite astonishing. The water we drink, it's recycled through our bodies, but basically we drink water, we process water, it goes back out into the sea eventually for, if it's part of a sewage system, or if we go and, if we went and, passed water out in the desert, that goes back into the earth, which then becomes part of the aquifer, or it becomes part of the clouds. So really, all of us, when we think about it, we are not separate. And this realization is so profound for us, I think, because it enables certainly my understanding of what music is to really have some traction. Because if we feel that we are no longer separate, we need some tools to open this feeling of togetherness. And I know of no other tool that is effective as music is. Because, again, music has this ability to stop time. And music is the gateway, as is the name of our little conversation today, to silence. So if we to really meaningfully listen to what the soul is about, or to listen to the story of the earth, or at the moment our earth crying in all this despair, we really need the space of silence. And it's very hard to reach silence without a bridge, and music to me is that bridge.
And what has your connection with the land of Australia and the Aboriginal heritage of Australia, has that been in any way a factor in shaping your who you are as a person? And if so, what is the inspiration from that culture?
This is a wonderful question. And I'd like to preface my answer by actually acknowledging the fact that I am here in Australia talking to you on Aboriginal land. It's been a really significant change in our culture in Australia that we are acknowledging that the so-called modern technocratic West, in this case the British, and they came with an erroneous assumption which they called Tyrannulius, this idea that the land was not inhabited because it was inhabited by a group of people who did not constitute mature culture. And what we've found since then is that the Aboriginal peoples of Australia, and indeed all cultures from around the world, constitute every single definition of culture. And this is a big thing in the whole world. I mean, I'm in dialogue with scholars from South America. There's a wonderful reclamation of indigenous culture going on in South America at the moment. In India, this process is just starting, this idea of looking at what are so-called tribal people and looking at the depth of culture that exists particularly in places like Orissa, where there's still very defined semi-nomadic indigenous cultures that have wonderful old and sublime traditions. So we have this idea that indigenous culture is important because it's our earliest culture, and it's a culture that was entirely oral. And this is another discussion about how music works. Music works very differently when we learn it orally as opposed to when we learn how to read it. And it's a bit like the same in all cultures. Now, Philippa, you and I have both been to India many times, and I think we both find aspects of, the depth of oral culture in India deeply inspiring. And for any of you who are from India, I say with the utmost gratitude, you have such insights just because of the land you live in and the spiritual history of that land, a land that spirituality is still living. We can all do our best in Australia, but the closest we have to this living tradition of India is our Indigenous peoples. So I do like to honour them, and I'm fortunate in my job at the Australian National University that we have a number of programs that are, very much targeted towards Indigenous engagement. It's my pleasure to work on a program which we call Naraburia, where we are training a new generation of 10 Indigenous composers. We hope to be the new composers of Australia, to tell the Indigenous stories of Australia, but to also say that if composers to really have the music of Australia, they actually need to lead from the Indigenous space. So to me, it's very exciting to think about these. I spend quite a lot of my time around Indigenous musicians and Indigenous thinkers, and I find that the insights of First Peoples, as mostly they like to be called as a collective term, are quite astonishing. And it's not from the Rousseauian idea of the noble savage. It's from the idea of shared lived experience over multiple generations and the wisdom that comes from a process of listening to land.
Absolutely beautiful. And what a way to honour those Indigenous cultures, to bring their music to a wider audience, because you can speak all the words you like, but actually to connect into those experiences through music takes us into another realm that actually talking can't do. But I want to bring you into this aspect of using music to take us beyond sound and into the sound of silence. And we mentioned Hildegard of Bingen, and she had pieces called, I think, Feather on the Breath of God was one of them. And someone listening to the music that you have composed gave a critique of saying, if there is a God, this music is close to the source. So how would you, in terms of sitting in front of a piece of artwork or in front of an object and translating it into music, where do you begin with translating the feeling, the experience of God into music? What would you say the sound of the divine is? How would you describe that?
Well, this is, again, you're asking wonderful questions and they're not easily answered. But I want to preface my answer by talking briefly about a project that I'm just working on at the moment with the British Antarctic Survey, which is using a series of recordings of the sounds of space and the cosmos that are made in the Halley receiver in Antarctica. Because it's like, if there's a sound of God, it's like the sound of this whole universe, in a sense. And we used to think that the universe was Newtonian, and this idea of, a two-dimensional scientificism is still very dominant in many aspects of culture. But we've since realized that space is not a perfect vacuum, and music and sound can travel in space, but they travel on a depth and a slowness that the human ear cannot hear. So it's possible through algorithmic experimentation to be able to actually bring this into human hearing. But even so, For example, a number of years, this great, 100 years ago, Einstein talked about gravitational waves, and a few years ago, they were discovered and proven. Now, they were proven by sound. People actually were able to record the acoustic phenomena, an actual acoustic sound of this wave of distortion in space-time. And to me, that's the mind of God, for want of a better term. So it's like, if we think this universe is multifaceted and magnificent and beyond time and space, what is beyond time and space? To me, whatever our definition of God is undefinable in some sense. There is, it's very easy to talk about, traditional religious definitions, and they certainly help. But I think all of us know that if there is a God, it's beyond our limited human intellects. So that's a part of it, is to surrender to the fact that really we will never be able to directly translate this feeling because it's so vast. But yet maybe there's an echo of an echo that can come to the human soul. And personally, I feel that there's only a chance of doing that if we follow a process of clean living. Now, of course, none of us are perfect. I'm not perfect. I have my weaknesses, and, I do my best to get over those. But at the same time, we can say, no matter what our weaknesses, we can make this commitment to have, for want of a better term, a pure life. A life that doesn't really indulge in vice needlessly. And that's a good start. And then to say a vice that does to others what we would like to have done to ourselves, some version of the golden rule. And then having a daily life that has spiritual precepts opens us to the process of regular meditation. And regular meditation, when there's a simpler, purer life, can become the most profound experience. And over time, I feel very strongly that meditation allows us to listen to the subtle realms of this universe. And this process of listening to these subtle realms is then very, very simple, because we have a body, we have a mind, we have an intellect that are all at the service of the deepest version of ourselves. And that once we do the listening, surely these skills we have spent years, perfecting or working on, in my case, there's still a long way to go. But the limited skills I have, I feel I can use very, very well now for music.
And you've been on this path of meditation now for over 20 years. Do you find that the more time goes on and the more you deepen into this process of cleansing yourself and your soul, if you like, that you become more finely tuned and a better instrument to catch that vibration, to catch that energy? Have you noticed a sense of acute and accentuated experience as time has gone on?
In the good days, definitely. But of course, we're all humans and we're all in a body. And so that, all our bodies suffer and all our minds suffer. So I would say that I'm also just human, and I have some moments that I think are pretty good. And then I have other moments where I'm like all of us, where I have attachment, I have anger, I have, envy. We're all like that. And I think it's okay to say that, we're all imperfect. We're all just on this path. But I think what can happen through regular meditation is that the peaks of distrust or anger or, all of these things, maybe we trust that they will pass a bit more. Sometimes they're still just as strong, but at least we know that there's an underlying experience that can happen beyond it. And certainly that's been a real bulwark in my life, to know that there's a process by which I can always forgive myself and others. And that process is through meditation and some act of surrender to the divine, which I think, takes us beyond religiosity to the point of religion, which is to say that we need to find a way to be comfortable with ourselves, with all our failings, and to feel that there is a spark of God inside us that can be purified through a good life. And certainly making good music really helps that. But sometimes making music is completely non-intellectual. It can just be sheer joy. And I love playing music with other musicians. It's an incredible act of communication, because I can literally meet another musician who I've never spoken a word to. And usually within 2 or 3 minutes, we can find a musical dialogue that can have nothing to do with culture. And so I think that there is something about music that really works on this fundamental level, that it takes us into these spaces. And I'd say that, I'm lucky to be able to play and compose, but I say to anyone, the experience is exactly the same by consciously listening to music, or maybe using the term deep listening. If we actually don't have music just as something to get through the day, or something to have when we're driving in a car, or when we're going for a jog, and we just allow ourselves time to really engage with those pieces of music that really move us, something remarkable can happen.
Well, let's see if we can make something remarkable happen right here and now, and practice what you're talking about here of deep listening, because you have got some musical instruments there. And if I could invite you to just use the sounds of these instruments to maybe just guide us into an experience of this mind of God, as you called it so beautifully, it would just be great to have that moment together.
Filippo, it's a pleasure. I'm going to show the instruments I've brought with me. I mean, I have, a house full of instruments, but I've got two. We talked about Hildegard of Bingen, so I thought I'd show you this beautiful triangle. Now, this is what's called a psaltery. Psaltery means in Latin psalms, and we think Hildegard learnt to sing the psalms with the aid of an instrument like this. So it can be plucked, which is very beautiful, and it can also be bowed, and it's so beautiful. It's like a proto violin. So already we start to feel the mind settle, because when things slow down musically, the human heart has to slow. We've been studying this for generations. So we'll spend a bit of time with the psaltery, and then when we come out of meditation, I'll show you a fun instrument. Breathing slowly. Sinking into your chair. Everything is okay. Everything will pass. If you'd like to soften your gaze or close your eyes, just breathing in and out. Thinking of this beautiful body that has served us through our entire life, we thank it. We thank our feet, our legs, our knees, our buttocks, our back, our stomach, our shoulders, our arms, our neck, our head, our wondrous brain, everything that constitutes this remarkable body. But let us dare to imagine that there is more. What if the truth is more radical? That there is a part of me that neither slumbers nor sleeps. There is a part of me that does not suffer. There is a part of me that will not give suffering to others. There is a part of me that in its deepest self longs for only one thing: union with the divine. Imagine if every day, even just for a minute, this super self could come and take a seat in our wondrous bodies. What a life we would have. This, my friends, is the soul. We all have one. We all are one. We are simply souls in a body. May this soul protect us and guide us. May the soul purify us, keep us safe, and allow us to forgive and help all other beings. We know we have this capacity. May it be our destiny. Shanti. So I'd like to show you another very interesting instrument. This is a more recent instrument because even though we've spoken about music as an old thing, I'm a composer, so I make new music and I write new music every week. And this is a relatively recent instrument that is, it takes great inspiration from the Caribbean, steel drum sets, but it's quite beautiful. It's called a hung, H-U-N-G. If you're from India, maybe it sounds a bit like Ghatam, which is the clay pot of South Indian classicism. With the hung, it's almost like every thought can become a little note. We can become light. We can become heavy. And this is music to me. Every moment of every day it's available like this to me as it is to you.
Kim, thank you so much for sharing so deeply with us. I feel like we've been on a journey through time, through space, and certainly through music. And I will really pay more attention to the sounds in the world around me and think about these things that you have shared. I hope we get a chance to do this again sometime and go more deeply, because I get the feeling that we've really skimmed the surface of what is clearly a deeply profound subject for us to dive into. But we have to leave it there for today. So Kim Cunio, bless you. Thank you for being with us, and all the best for your onward journey. Thank you.
Thank you, Philippa, and go well, dear friends.
Thank you so much. And thank you to you as well for joining in and listening from where you are. I hope you feel equally inspired to think about the music in your life and what effect it's having on you. And I hope that you'll join us again for tomorrow's masterclass. And until then, I wish you well, keep safe, Om Shanti, and goodbye. "21 Masterclasses in New Consciousness, new ways of thinking, being and doing for the new you." Pioneering thinkers from countries right around the world.